Imagine standing outside a massive Toys R Us store, watching the lights go out one by one, shelves that once overflowed with color and wonder stripped bare, children pressing their small hands and faces against locked glass doors, unable to understand why their magical kingdom had simply disappeared. This is not just a story about a business that failed. This is a story about greed, betrayal, and the devastating human cost of corporate ruthlessness operating completely unchecked. 70 years. 70 years of birthday memories, holiday traditions, and childhood wonder erased almost overnight. And the question that should haunt every single one of us is this: how does a beloved institution, one that defined generations of childhoods across the entire world, simply vanish? Not because children stopped playing, not because toys went out of style, but because a small group of financial engineers decided that extracting wealth mattered infinitely more than preserving something truly irreplaceable. To understand how far Toys R Us fell, you first need to understand how magnificent it once was. In 1948, a young entrepreneur named Charles Lazarus had opened a modest baby furniture store in Washington District of Columbia. But Lazarus had a vision far bigger than cribs and changing tables. He noticed parents were also asking for toys, and that simple observation changed everything. Lazarus pioneered the concept of the dedicated toy superstore, a place where children could walk through aisles stacked floor to ceiling with every imaginable plaything. The idea exploded. By its peak, Toys R Us operated over 1,500 stores across the globe, employed 64,000 people, and generated billions in annual revenue. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Toys R Us was not simply a retailer, it was a childhood institution. It was the place where holiday wish lists came to life, where birthdays felt magical, and where generations of families created memories that lasted lifetimes. Geoffrey the Giraffe was not just a mascot, he was a cultural icon. Fast forward to 2005 and everything changes. Three private equity giants, Kohlberg, Kravis, Roberts, Bain Capital, and Vornado Realty, swoop in and acquire Toys R Us in a leverage buyout worth $6.6 billion. Now, if that term leverage buyout sounds complicated, let me break it down in plain terms, because understanding this is absolutely critical to understanding everything that follows. Imagine walking into a bank, pointing at someone else's house, and using that house as collateral to borrow the money to buy it. Then, once the purchase is complete, you hand the mortgage directly to the person who used to own it and tell them they are now responsible for paying it back. That is essentially what happened here. Kohlberg, Kravis, Roberts, Bain Capital, and Vornado used Toys R Us's own assets as collateral to borrow the acquisition funds, then transferred that enormous debt burden directly onto the company's books. Toys R Us did not choose this debt. It was handed to them on day one. Here is where the story turns truly devastating. From the moment that leverage buyout was finalized, Toys R Us was buried under approximately $5 billion in debt. Not debt from bad decisions it made. Not debt from failed expansion. Debt that was created entirely to fund its own acquisition and then handed directly back to the company to carry. Think about what that means in practical terms. Every single year, Toys R Us was forced to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into interest payments alone. Money that could have built a world-class website, money that could have modernized stores, money that could have competed with Amazon and Walmart, who were aggressively investing in technology and e-commerce infrastructure during this exact same period. While competitors were building the future of retail, Toys R Us was financially paralyzed, running as fast as it could just to stay in place. The race was rigged before the starting gun ever fired. But the debt burden was only part of the story. Long before the private equity takeover, Toys R Us had already suffered a critical digital wound that never fully healed. Back in the year 2000, Toys R Us made what seemed like a smart move. They signed an exclusive agreement with Amazon to become the sole toy seller on the platform. One partner, one storefront, one digital future. But Amazon quietly broke that agreement by allowing third-party toy sellers onto the platform anyway, directly undermining everything Toys R Us had been promised. Toys R Us fought back and sued Amazon. They actually won the lawsuit in 2006, forcing Amazon to end the partnership. But here's the devastating reality. Those 6 years consumed in legal battles were 6 years not spent building their own digital infrastructure. While Amazon and Walmart were perfecting e-commerce, Toys R Us was stuck in a courtroom, and the private equity owners showed almost no urgency to modernize the company afterward. The digital gap became permanent. With the equity firms firmly in control, Toys R Us entered a damaging cycle of leadership instability. Executive after executive was cycled through the company, each installed not necessarily for their retail expertise, but for their alignment with the financial priorities of KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado. Decision-making became painfully slow, disconnected from the realities of the shop floor, and increasingly driven by financial engineering rather than genuine retail innovation. The consequences were visible everywhere. Store renovation projects that could have refreshed the shopping experience were delayed for years, then quietly canceled altogether. Employee training budgets, the very investments that build knowledgeable and motivated staff, were slashed to cut costs on paper. Customers began noticing the difference immediately. Shelves were disorganized, staff seemed undertrained, and the magic that once defined a Toys R Us visit was fading fast. Meanwhile, the equity partners continued collecting their management fees without interruption, drawing income from a company they were slowly hollowing out from the inside. And here's where the story takes an even darker turn. While Toys R Us was suffocating under billions of dollars in debt, KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado were quietly helping themselves to tens of millions of dollars every single year in what they called advisory and management fees. Let that sink in for a moment. The very firms that loaded this company with debt were simultaneously billing it for the privilege of their guidance. These were not bonuses tied to performance. There were no targets to hit, no growth milestones to achieve, no requirement that the company actually improve. These fees were guaranteed extractions, collected year after year regardless of how badly the business was bleeding. Every dollar that flowed into the pockets of these equity firms was a dollar that could have funded a store renovation, upgraded the technology infrastructure, or invested in the e-commerce capabilities that might have kept Toys R Us competitive. Instead, the money moved in one direction only, away from the business and toward the investors who were supposed to be saving it. By 2013, Toys R Us was running out of time and options. New leadership arrived with ambitious turnaround plans, promising store renovations, better customer experiences, and a stronger digital presence, but those plans existed only on paper. Every dollar the company generated was already spoken for, consumed by crushing debt payments and the ongoing management fees flowing directly to KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado. There was simply nothing left to invest. Meanwhile, walking into a Toys R Us store felt increasingly depressing. Flickering lights, cluttered layouts, and outdated displays stood in sharp contrast to the clean, modern environments Target and Amazon were offering customers. The difference was impossible to ignore. Employees felt it too. Layoffs began quietly at first, then accelerated. Hours were slashed. Workers who had dedicated years to the company watched the deterioration happening in real time. They could see exactly where this was heading, even as executives stood before cameras insisting everything was under control and a recovery was absolutely on the horizon. Then came September 2017, the moment that changed everything. Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, and immediately the carefully rehearsed messaging machine kicked into gear. Leadership stepped before cameras with reassuring smiles and practiced confidence. This was simply a restructuring, they said. A strategic reorganization. Stores would remain open, jobs were safe, employees had nothing to worry about. The public relations language was deliberate and precise. Chapter 11, they explained, was not a death sentence. It was a tool. A temporary measure to reorganize the crushing debt load and emerge stronger on the other side. Workers were told to keep showing up, keep serving customers, keep believing. But behind those closed boardroom doors, an entirely different conversation was happening. The equity firms were not drawing up revival plans. They were running numbers on exit strategies, calculating what could still be extracted, measuring what remained worth salvaging for themselves. The reassurances were not promises, they were a delay tactic, and the clock was already running. Then came the gut punch nobody wanted to believe was coming. March 2018. Just 6 months after executives stood at podiums promising recovery, promising stability, promising that Chapter 11 was simply a speed bump, Toys R Us announced it would liquidate entirely and close every single remaining United States store. Not restructure, not downsize. Liquidate. The chaos that followed was immediate and devastating. Liquidation sales turned once magical aisles into stripped, hollow corridors. Shelves that had overflowed with color and wonder stood bare under flickering fluorescent lights. Store managers, people who had dedicated decades of their lives to this company, broke down crying in front of their teams, struggling to find words that simply did not exist for moments like this. And the employees, 33,000 American workers, suddenly found themselves unemployed with almost no warning whatsoever, no transition period, no meaningful support system, and in many cases, absolutely no severance pay at all. 33,000 lives upended overnight. The devastation did not stop at American borders. When Toys R Us collapsed, it sent shockwaves across the entire globe. Approximately 64,000 jobs were eliminated worldwide, from Canada to the United Kingdom, from Australia to Central Europe. Families in dozens of countries woke up to the same nightmare that American workers had just lived through. But the human cost extended far beyond the employees themselves. Shopping malls across suburban America had built their entire foot traffic models around Toys R Us as an anchor tenant. When those massive stores went dark, the ripple effects were immediate and brutal. Neighboring restaurants lost their weekend lunch crowds, small boutique shops that depended on holiday. Toy shoppers saw their customer base evaporate overnight. Entire retail corridors that had thrived for decades suddenly found themselves in freefall. These were not abstract economic statistics. These were communities, neighborhoods, and livelihoods that had been quietly but catastrophically dismantled, not by market forces alone, but by deliberate financial decisions made in boardrooms far removed from any consequence. Now, here is where the story becomes truly infuriating. While 33,000 workers walked away with little to no severance, the private equity firms had already secured their fortunes long before the final collapse. This was not an accident. This was the system working exactly as designed. KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado Realty are estimated to have collectively extracted over $200 million in fees alone throughout their ownership of Toys R Us. Not $200 million in profits from a thriving business. $200 million pulled directly from a company already drowning in debt. Think about that for a moment. The same company that could not afford to pay a single mother 2 weeks of severance was simultaneously writing enormous checks to the very firms that engineered its destruction. The executives and equity partners walked away financially intact. Their portfolios survived. Their bonuses survived. Their reputations largely survived. The workers walked away with absolutely nothing. Toys R Us was not an isolated tragedy. It was a blueprint repeated across American retail with chilling consistency. Sears, once the most powerful retailer in the world, collapsed under private equity debt loading after Eddie Lampert's financial engineering gutted its operational capacity. Payless Shoe Source filed for bankruptcy twice after leverage buyout debt strangled every attempt at recovery. Gymboree, a beloved children's clothing brand, followed the identical path from acquisition to debt burden to liquidation. The pattern is unmistakable and deliberate. Private equity firms execute a leveraged buyout, transfer the debt onto the acquired company, extract management fees regardless of performance, and position themselves to profit through dividends and financial maneuvers, whether the business ultimately survives or collapses entirely. This model is not broken. It is functioning exactly as designed. The investors generate returns either way. The company absorbs all the risk. The workers absorb all the consequences. Profit is privatized, destruction is socialized, and the cycle continues unchallenged. But behind every spreadsheet and debt restructuring memo, there were real human beings whose lives were permanently altered. Consider Linda, a 20-year Toys R Us veteran who dedicated 2 decades to the company, only to watch her pension evaporate overnight when liquidation was announced. She had planned her entire retirement around that promise. Then there was Marcus, a store manager responsible for 40 employees. 3 weeks before Christmas, he stood in a break room and told every single one of them they no longer had jobs. He described it as the worst moment of his professional life, watching fathers and mothers process the news in real time. And there was Diane, a single parent who lost her health insurance without warning, scrambling to find coverage for her children within days. These are not abstract casualties. These are neighbors, parents, and dedicated workers discarded by a financial system that reduced their livelihoods to a single line item on a balance sheet, erased with the stroke of a pen. Despite the devastation left behind, the regulatory response was nearly non-existent. Private equity firms operate in remarkably low oversight environments, structured deliberately to avoid the scrutiny applied to publicly traded companies. There are no requirements to prioritize employee welfare, no mandatory disclosures about fee extractions, and no legal consequences for loading a company with debt until it collapses. Lobbying efforts by the private equity industry have spent decades ensuring protective legislation never gains traction in Congress. Bills that would have required severance protections for workers displaced by leveraged buyouts have repeatedly stalled, quietly suffocated by industry influence. But the workers refuse to disappear quietly. Former Toys R Us employees organized under a group called Rise Up Retail, staging protests and generating enormous public pressure directly targeting KKR and Bain Capital by name. Their efforts worked, partially. The equity firms eventually established a $20 million hardship fund for former employees. $20 million sounds significant until you remember these firms extracted over $200 million in fees alone. It was a symbolic gesture, a fraction of what was taken, achieved only because ordinary people refused to stay silent. Toys R Us has attempted a small-scale comeback through boutique stores, but make no mistake, the empire is gone forever. What remains is a ghost of something generations of children once called magical. So here's the question worth sitting with. What kind of economy do we actually want to live in? One where financial engineers can extract hundreds of millions from beloved institutions, load them with impossible debt, and walk away wealthy while communities crumble? Or one where businesses remain genuinely accountable to the workers and communities that made them great in the first place? Because somewhere right now there's a child pressing their face against a locked glass door, wondering why the magic disappeared. They do not understand leverage buyouts or management fees or equity extraction strategies. They just know something wonderful is gone. And the real question we must ask ourselves is this: who is truly paying the price for unchecked greed? The answer has never been the ones collecting the fees.